1988 at a convention, Henk Rogers from Bulletproof Software, who was promoting the game Go as a tougher version of chess, did not receive any attention from the audience. His hired assistant also seemed to be more interested in a different game. However, when Henk visited the Tetris booth, he initially had doubts but soon got addicted to the game. Henk later meets with a bank manager named Eddie and confesses his obsession with Tetris, revealing that he has obtained the license for PC, game console, and arcade rights to the game. Henk proceeds to narrate the history of Tetris, starting with its creator, Alexey Pazhitnov. About 4 years before, Alexey was a programmer for the Russian government, but also created games as a side gig. With the help of some colleagues, he transformed Tetris from a simple game featuring falling parentheses to a more colorful one, which gained immense popularity. 2 years later, Robert Stein from Andromeda Software stumbled upon Tetris by buying game properties in Europe for a low price and reselling them in the US at a higher price. Stein relentlessly pursued Alexey's bosses until they took the licensing request to Elorg. He then went to London to meet media mogul Robert Maxwell and his son Kevin for an international licensing deal, wherein Stein would receive royalties. Henk proceeds with his narrative, recounting how he visited the Nintendo headquarters in Japan to meet their CEO, Hiroshi Yamauchi. He demonstrated Tetris to Yamauchi, who was impressed with the game. Despite receiving an initial offer of $500,000 for a buyout, Henk declined the offer and instead convinced Yamauchi to form a partnership by drawing a parallel to iconic pairs such as Mario and Luigi, or Zelda and Link. Later, Henk requested a $3 million loan from Eddie to purchase Nintendo cartridges and arcade consoles. Eddie agrees to provide the loan with increased interest rates and Henk putting his house down as collateral. Henk talks to his wife Akemi at home in Tokyo. She is worried about his deal, but Henk makes her feel better by saying that their kids are playing Tetris so much that the house is very quiet. Henk's daughter Maya is enjoying the game the most. Henk talks on the phone with Kevin. Kevin tells Henk that he and his father sold the rights for Tetris arcade games to Sega in Japan. Henk gets mad and goes back to see Yamauchi at Nintendo. He asks Yamauchi for some money in advance. Yamauchi invites Henk to meet his colleagues in Seattle. Henk goes on a trip to Seattle to see Nintendo's president, Minoru Arakawa, and VP, Howard Lincoln. They tell him about the Game Boy, a new handheld game console that will come out soon with Super Mario Land. However, Henk thinks it would be better if they include Tetris with it instead of Mario. He tells them that he would get the rights to make Tetris games for the Game Boy. Henk goes to London to meet the Maxwells. They are already in a meeting with Stein, who is upset about not getting paid. Henk asks the Maxwells if he can buy the rights to make Tetris games for handheld consoles, but they do not give him a clear answer. After Henk and Stein leave, Kevin asks his father about missing money from employees' retirement funds, but Maxwell ignores the question and focuses on getting Tetris. As Henk and Stein leave, they seem to make a deal for the handheld rights. Arakawa and Lincoln call Henk and tell him that Stein is selling the rights to make Tetris games for handheld consoles to Atari for $100,000 as a way of getting back at the Maxwells for not paying him. Despite being warned about the dangers of traveling to communist Russia, Henk goes to Moscow to get licensing rights for Tetris. He meets a girl named Sasha who helps him find the office of the people in charge of the rights. He talks to the president, Belaikov, and learns that they only have the rights for PC and not handheld or console. Henk shows Belaikov his Japanese Tetris game, but Belaikov thinks it's illegal. Henk persuades Belaikov to meet again to discuss the deal. As they leave, 2 KGB men tell Henk to leave the country. Kevin goes to Moscow to meet with Valentin Trifonov, who is a part of the Communist Party and handles foreign trade. The Maxwells believe that Trifonov's connections to Mikhail Gorbachev will make it easier for them to acquire Tetris. The next day, Henk and Sasha went back to Elorg. There, they met Alexey, Trifonov, and his men for the first time. Trifonov accused Henk of doing illegal things, like coming with a tourist visa that was fake. Alexey also did not trust Henk at first. Belaikov said that nobody had bought the arcade rights to Tetris. Meanwhile, Stein and Kevin arrived to meet with Belaikov, and Henk checked the signed contract. He found out that Stein took the arcade rights. Belaikov gave Stein a new contract for the handheld rights. Finally, Alexey gave Henk and Sasha a ride home. Kevin meets with Trifonov again, and Trifonov confesses to Kevin that they were spying on his meeting with Belaikov. Trifonov admits that communism in Russia will soon end, and he wants to fulfill their deal. However, unbeknownst to Kevin, Trifonov is receiving bribes from Maxwell to help obtain Tetris. Henk has dinner with Alexey and his wife, Nina, at their home. Nina initially thinks that Henk stole Tetris, but he convinces them that he has honest intentions. Alexey shows Henk the original version of Tetris and lets him play. While they are talking, they hear a knock on the door, and Alexey and Nina fear it might be the KGB looking for Henk. After realizing it's just a neighbor, Alexey tries to get Henk to leave, but Henk convinces him to go out with him to continue their conversation. Alexey takes Henk to a place where people want freedom from the Soviet Union. They party and dance to music, and Henk becomes friends with Alexey. But the KGB spies on Henk and takes pictures of him. They threaten Henk's family and hurt him before stealing his pants, because they are levious. Henk goes back to his hotel room and finds it in a mess. Sasha comes and tells him why the KGB is after him. She tries to convince him to leave, and even kisses him, but Henk reminds her he is married. Trifonov meets Alexey and his sons, Dmitry and Peter, and implies that he could harm them like he did to Alexey's father. Henk calls Akemi and instructs her to contact his lawyers. Henk and Stein separately go back to Elorg. Stein complains about the new contract but eventually signs it. Henk talks to Belaikov and suggests a new deal. Henk wants $25,000 upfront and offers 25 cents for every game sold because he needs money. He thinks that Tetris could sell up to 20 million copies, making Belaikov $5 million. Belaikov meets with Trifonov and says that Tetris will go to Mirasoft. Later, Belaikov tells Henk that he can make an offer for Tetris within a week and gives him a letter of intent to sign. Alexey meets Henk and they take a taxi together to avoid being followed. Alexey tells Henk about his father's story and how his career was ruined when he signed a letter of protest for his colleague who was jailed for selling his book abroad. Alexey reveals that Sasha, who was working with Henk, is actually a KGB agent who has been targeting him. They both see Sasha talking to Trifonov. Alexey then takes Henk to an airport. Henk didn't keep his promise to attend Maya's school concert, and Maxwell meets with Arakawa and Lincoln to make sure Mirasoft gets Tetris. Trifonov has one of his men attack Belaikov, as ordered by Maxwell. At Henk's apartment, he receives a fax that tells him he's no longer part of the Tetris deal. He also gets a threatening photo of Sasha kissing him that could be shown to his family. When Akemi and Maya come, Henk is more worried about losing the deal than missing Maya's concert, which causes Maya to cry and run to her room. Belaikov goes to see Alexey at his apartment to tell him that Mirasoft will get Tetris, and if Alexey can't fix things, he will be fired. Belaikov then gives Alexey a letter to send to Henk, which Alexey does from his work. Meanwhile, Kevin finds his father shredding papers and asks for the $1 million they need to pay Elorg, but his father says they don't have that much money. Henk goes back to Nintendo to talk to Arakawa and Lincoln and show them the letter. They tell Henk that Atari has been selling Tetris cartridges. According to Henk, Stein and the Maxwells were dishonest and the letter had expired a day earlier, indicating that Atari has no claim to Tetris. Henk convinces Arakawa and Lincoln to travel with him to Moscow to finalize their deal before the Maxwells do anything else. Alexey finds out he has lost his job and sees people taking his belongings away. He also sees Trifonov talking to his sons, and it seems like Trifonov is threatening to harm them. Trifonov calls Maxwell to keep talking about their agreement. Sasha discovers that Trifonov is trying to do what is best for him, and not for their country. Then, Stein talks to the Maxwells, and he hits Kevin for secretly going to Moscow to get the deal with Elorg. He thinks this move would harm his payment. Maxwell reads the papers and decides to go to Moscow with Kevin to speak to Gorbachev, to work against Henk. When Henk comes back, he tries to see Alexey, but Alexey is angry at him for the troubles he faced for working with Henk. Meanwhile, Trifonov and his men hear about Henk's return and quickly head to Elorg. The Maxwells arrived at Elorg first, followed by Henk, Arakawa, and Lincoln. Maxwell told Belikov to sign, but Henk realized that the Maxwells didn't have any money to pay Alorg with. Belikov saw through the lies and refused to sign. Maxwell tried to attack Belikov, but Belikov headbutted him. Belikov then signed with Nintendo and told the group to leave Moscow right away. Trifonov confronted Maxwell in front of Kevin and Sasha, revealing his secret dealings after learning that they lost the contract. Trifonov tries to catch Henk, Arakawa, and Lincoln, but Alexey comes to rescue them and drives them to the airport. There is a fast and dangerous car chase where the KGB goons pursue the four men. They finally reach the airport and board the first available flight. Trifonov assumes they are going to Tokyo, so he hops on that plane, but he soon realizes that they are actually on a different flight. Meanwhile, Sasha comes to arrest Trifonov for betraying his country. Henk goes back to his Tokyo apartment and sets up a stage for Maya to perform, to make up for not going to her school concert. He says sorry to her in Japanese, and Maya does the show for him while he and Akemi watch. He also shows her the $5 million check for bulletproof software. Later, the Game Boy is released with Tetris, and it becomes very popular. Gorbachev quits his job, and countries in Europe are opening their borders. Henk sends Alexey a Game Boy. Some time later, Alexey and his family move to the United States where they meet the Rogers family. Henk and Alexey hug each other as a friendly greeting. At the end of the story, it says that Henk Rogers and Alexey Pazhitnov worked together to create the Tetris company. Robert Stein continued to make and sell games, but he was very upset about losing Tetris. Robert Maxwell took a lot of money and got into a lot of debt, and his company failed after he died in a strange way. Kevin was later arrested for the theft and went bankrupt, but he was found not guilty of fraud. In 2014, Maya became the new CEO of Tetris. Tetris is still one of the most popular games ever made, with over 1 billion copies sold.